Right, yeah, sure. So hello everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. My name is Ruth-Anne, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm really excited to be giving a talk today on hellscapes and how to navigate them, exploring hellish landscapes in the long 19th century. So as a quick introduction to me, I recently graduated with my MA in Literary Studies from Lancaster University, and I'm currently the reviews editor at Fantastica Journal as well. And I'm hoping to develop this research into a PhD proposal, so I would really appreciate any thoughts or feedback you might have. My details are on the screen there, so do feel free to get in touch. So in today's class, I'm going to be speaking a little bit about hellscapes and how to navigate them. So we're going to start off with some background to the term hellscapes. It's my term and I kind of randomly came up with it. So I figured I should probably give you some background as to what it's about and why it's so relevant. And then I'll show you some hellscapes in practice with case studies from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and James Thomson's The City of Dreadful Night. Though hellscapes are not limited to poetic texts, both of the case studies today are from long poems. And I think the reason I chose them is because through the 19th century, the poetic legacies are probably much more obvious or overt because of the legacies of people like Dante and Milton. So it just makes it a little bit clearer for you to see. So let's dive straight in with hellscapes and hells. So hell. It's not something we might think of as particularly relevant anymore, often resigning it to an outdated and particularly Western construct in theology, spanning various religions, but most especially in Christianity. And this opinion is one commonly held by historians and sociologists of religion too, such as Alice K. Turner, who exemplifies this in stating, by the end of the 19th century, hell had virtually disappeared from popular culture. And this is an opinion I've seen come up again and again. But if we dig a little deeper, perhaps descend a little further even, then this critical opinion becomes somewhat more complicated. This is a screenshot of a Google Ngram for the word hell, which charts the term's use in Google's database of printed materials. So while this data is by no means exhaustive, it does illustrate a slight decline in the use of the term hell between 1800 and 1840. However, what's really interesting is that hell maintains its use well into the 20th century and begins to increase at various points. You may in fact note that we're actually on an upward trend right now. German, Italian, Spanish, and French all do follow similar trends, demonstrating at the very least that this is not a purely Anglo-centric phenomenon. So somewhat ironically, we might want to ask what the hell is happening here. If hell is in decline to the point of disappearance across the 19th century, then why are we still using it in our language so frequently? I've added two more critics here who echo Turner's sentiment about the decline of hell. So we have Scott Bruce in the Penguin Book of Hell, who says, while the belief in hell as an actual place declined in recent centuries, the idea of hell has endured as a dominant metaphor. And Michael Wheeler, although a belief in everlasting punishment declined, a fear of some kind of hell remained for many, also talking about the 19th century there. I've chosen these two critics in particular for a couple of reasons. First, I want to look at their publication dates, so 2018 and 1994, which is slightly longer than my lifetime. So they demonstrate that our conception of hell hasn't actually changed or developed in nearly 3 decades. So there is an urgent need to reevaluate these ideas, given that the word itself hasn't actually gone anywhere. We're actually using it more and more each day. And secondly, they both suggest something slightly different to Turner, as they both indicate that while hell is a theological construct of that punitive place filled with fire and brimstone has declined, some remnants of hell have continued beyond the 19th century. So hell survives as a fear, as something to be wary of, or as a metaphor in our language. So, for example, a common phrase is hot as hell, or that kind of metaphor, or my favourite Lancashire phrase, hell's bells, buckets of blood, which is kind of a local curse, I guess. So To me, all of this indicates a need to pivot our questioning. We need to ask not why a belief in hell declined or if hell has disappeared, because the evidence is clearly pointing to the opposite. So instead, we need to ask how we went from this is our idea of hell to this. So how did hell shift from being a fiery pit whose location and existence were taken extremely seriously and became the focus of many pieces of art and literature, to being a way to express climate change or even a pandemic? So these are two headlines from recent years, one expressing, I guess, dismay at a heat wave coming, and the other around the COVID-19 pandemic. So the answer to this question I want to propose is where the hellscape comes in. So what is the hellscape? This is my attempt at a short, pithy definition, I suppose. So the hellscape is a unique literary construction that enables texts to conceive imagined landscapes as hell-like spaces. It's when texts use the temporal and spatial features commonly seen in depictions of hell from literature, religion, and art, but take those features outside of hell's domain. And usually these texts do this to explore kind of the darker, deeper anxieties about certain aspects of our society, whether that be political complaints for social justice or anxieties around climate change. However, to find the hellscape first requires a descent through hell's depths, uncovering its constituent features before rising back to the surface and observing those hellish qualities in fictional accounts of other spaces. So let's take a closer look at hell in literature and theology. In one of the few recent studies on hell, Rachel Faulkner has explored hell in contemporary literature as influenced by katabatic descent narratives. And katabatic is just a word for descent narratives. It means when a protagonist will descend into hell on a journey. And so think Dante's Inferno is a very obvious example of that journey process. And Rachel Faulkner has stated, hell itself is a chronotype, whose most familiar inherited temporal and spatial features include narrow constraints on spatial movement, an absence of future orientation experienced by an individual both separate and alienated from his or her environment and from other people, despite being crowded into close proximity with others in an undifferentiated mass. So just to unpick some of the theoretical terminology that Faulkner is using there, chronotype comes from Michelle Bakhtin's theoretical term, and she's using this to define hell's literary features and in literary depictions. And Bakhtin's theory identifies time and space's inseparability in literature's composition, so stating, we will give the name chronotype literally time-space to the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships artistically expressed in literature. So a way to kind of, I guess, visualize the chronotype is that it imagines all literary genres and tropes as sitting on different intersections between time and space. So for example, we would map quest narratives at one point on that time-space axis, and meanwhile romances would sit at a different intersection on the same chart. So here, Faulkner has specified hell's chronotopic features in katabatic narratives, where protagonists descend to hell on a journey, as in Dante's Inferno or Homer's The Odyssey. And this comprises three interconnected elements to form hell's chronotype, being restricted spatial movement, constrained temporal progression, and the resulting alienation or isolation. As we are here at Romancing the Gothic, I thought it would be appropriate to situate this research within Gothic studies. And in particular, this is Baldick's quite famous and frequently quoted definition of the Gothic, which I'm sure many of us have seen time and time again and might even roll our eyes at now. But what's interesting is that this definition uses the same chronotopic structure as Faulkner, with particular types of time and space culminating to produce an effect. So Baldick says that for the Gothic effect to be attained, a tale should combine a fearful sense of inheritance in time with a claustrophobic sense of enclosure in space, these two dimensions reinforcing one another to produce an impression of sickening descent into disintegration. and descent. Notice that Baldock there is using the same language of descent with similar restrictions on time and space to characterize the Gothic. So there are definitely connections then between Hellscapes and the Gothic, though I would like to situate Hellscapes as kind of Gothic adjacent, because while the Hellscape is looking at literary depictions of the hell-like or the hellish, the Gothic has a tendency to literalize hell and materialize it in all of its fiery damnation. So I think Lewis the Monk is quite the first example that comes to mind there. Although maybe new forms of the Gothic, like eco-Gothic, are starting to foreground hellscapes more and more, using hell to express the fear and despair towards a decaying environment. Andrew Michael Hurley's novels come to mind here. However, hell as a theological term is far more than a set of literary chronotopic features. And Christopher Burden has identified that Faulkner treats hell as historical rather than eschatological. So Faulkner's methodology is focused on hell's historical presence in literature over its theological significance as one of Christian eschatology's four last things, along with death, judgment, and heaven. So if we bring these theological contexts into hell's defining characteristics, I argue it enables a deeper understanding of hell and highlights hell's religious and cultural significance beyond the literary texts. And at the same time, we'll see similarities between Faulkner's chronotopic hells and theological ones. So first off, hell is not a singular theological entity. It spans numerous cultures, languages, and religions. Though starting off, as all definitions do, with the OED, it defines hell as a place regarded in various religions as a spiritual realm of evil and suffering, often traditionally depicted as a place of perpetual fire. This definition then sums up some of hell's critical components in Western culture's stereotypical depictions. It is a perpetual, eternal realm of suffering, which expands on Faulkner's chronotopic hell by revealing its punitive purpose to inflict evil and suffering. And I'm highlighting Western culture here specifically because, as Turner argues, other great world religions have hells of their own. Hindus number several million of them, and Buddhists count from 8 hells to several thousand. None of these hold a soul eternally, however, and no other religion has raised hell to such importance as Christianity. So for this reason, my focus on hell is in Christian settings, given its extensive imaginative influence and theological importance, particularly for Victorian Britain and their literary depictions of, for example, urban cultures, which I'll foreground in my analysis of Thompson later. Etymology reveals that biblical translations of hell into the English language have actually influenced hell's conception as that eternal place of suffering. And this is my quick little diagram to explain where some of this etymology has come from. So let's start with the Bible's Old Testament, where hell comes from 2 Hebrew words, Sheol and Gehenna. Wheeler expands that Sheol means the unseen world, as a place both for bad and the good, and refers to the intermediate state of the soul previous to judgment. Meanwhile, Gehenna is a word for common sewer of a city where the bodies of the worst criminals were dumped and which came to mean punishment. Meanwhile, in the New Testament, Bruce similarly foregrounds that there are 2 words in the Bible from the Greek. So we have Hades, where the soul of the dead lived in a realm either beneath the earth's surface or on a distant shore, and Tartarus, where particularly wicked individuals suffered eternal punishments. Both the Old Testament Hebrew and the New Testament Greek then have 2 terms for hell, one referring to the place and the other referring to the punishments. However, the locations differ between each terms. Gehenna is a place outside the city, and Hades is located below the earth's surface. But for most English versions of the Bible, all 4 of these terms translate into hell, indicating that the Anglo-Christian hell condenses numerous meanings. Furthermore, then, the English word hell actually has different etymological origins again. which Faulkner has identified as stemming from the Old Norse hel or helen, meaning to cover or conceal. So this etymology adds further connotations to hell as a place, prevalent in Faulkner's chronotopic features of narrow constraints of spatial movement. And it also introduces that eternal aspect. Hell is a place of entrapment, somewhere to be covered, concealed, constrained, it's inescapable. And drawing on all of these different etymologies suggests that hell's theological construction is far from straightforward. At the same time, though, it does illustrate some similarities between chronotopic and theological hells. So while the physical location may vary, hell is a place of typically eternal suffering for souls in a punitive afterlife, and literary depictions then use limited spatial movement, a lack of temporal chronology, and alienation to communicate this horrific perpetual punishment. So having established the identifying characteristics of theological and chronotopic hells, we need to come back to the hellscape for a moment and where the hellscape comes into all of this. So I would argue that hell has shifted from being that otherworldly plane of punishment to becoming a widely used idiom. And Bruce has foregrounded this, saying in modern discourse, hell serves as an all-pervasive metaphor for any kind of difficulty or extreme. However, this transition did not happen instantaneously. It's the result of over 2 centuries of linguistic and imaginative change. The hellscape examines descriptions of space and landscape as hellish or hell-like. It identifies that transition from hell as another worldly plane to hell as a metaphor, analysing what happens when writers depict a hell on earth, but often in unfamiliar or imagined spaces. Hell being distinct here from its physical location and often occupying those worldviews where eternal punishment in hell doesn't exist. The hellscape refers to those permeable literary spaces where readers can almost feel the penitential flames reaching up through the pages. If hell is the absence of God, or as Pope Francis kind of proposed, hell is wanting to be distant from God, then the hellscape is where God's presence and those familiar religious practices that underpin God's existence become most ambiguous, elusive, and frighteningly intangible. This next bit might feel a little bit off-piece, but bear with me, I promise it's relevant. So I want to argue that Doreen Massey's spatial theory actually helps clarify this distinction between hells and hellscapes by differentiating what we mean by space and place. I'm finding spatial theory becoming more and more relevant important in this research because it distinguishes from what hell used to be to what hell became across the 19th century and indeed is still becoming today. So Massey states that political and academic positions all rested on a view of place as bounded, as in various ways a site of authenticity, as singular, fixed, and unproblematic in its identity. Meanwhile, space becomes the dimension of things being, existing at the same time, of simultaneity. It becomes the dimension of multiplicity. So a way to perhaps visualize this difference between place and space. If you're on a train journey, you will have specified stops that are usually named after or denote a specific place, so a town or a city. But in between, when you're moving between those stations, you're still moving through whatever country, so let's say England, you're still moving through England, but you're also going through specific towns and cities and places and the people who live there, perhaps without distinguishing them from one another. That space becomes one of simultaneity, one where different people and lives are existing around you at the same time. So that can be quite a useful way, I find, to distinguish space and place. So if we look back at hell's etymological origins, its conception as a place has repeatedly occurred, both in the OED, in the Hebrew Gehenna, and the Greek Hades. Hell as a place is a prevalent idea in katabatic narratives too, the ones that Faulkner has explored, where protagonists journeyed to hell as a separate realm. So another way of locating the hellscape is that it encapsulates this movement from hell as a place to hell as a space, using the suffix scape to denote a specified type of scene and highlight hell's new spatial elements. Reflecting on that introductory examination of hell's perceived decline then across the 19th century, what we could reframe this as is that hell is no longer being conceived as that burning pit of punishment, but becomes all pervasive, as Bruce argued. And in becoming free of those constraints as a place, it develops a spatial aspect. It becomes malleable to new locations, so hell starts to permeate its own borders and inflame the imagination. And speaking of inflaming the imagination, and as my case for the hellscape's continuing relevance in contemporary literature, allusions to the hellish and the damnable have somewhat exploded at an exponential rate over the last 2 years, and we could only wonder what kind of world would inspire such hellish imaginations, but perhaps we'll leave that for speculation for today. So a few publications I've tracked with just hell in the name, or kind of hell-related subjects in the name, include Damnation Spring by Ash Davidson, Pandemonium by Andrew Macmillan, Hell of a Book by Jason Mott, Fall or Dodge in Hell by Neil Stevenson, Hope in Hell, A Decade to Confront the Climate Emergency by Jonathan Parrott, and 3 Years in Hell, The Brexit Chronicles by Sinead O'Toole, as well as Midnight Mass and Lucifer on Netflix as examples of some other media that are coming out as well. I could go on, but hopefully you get the picture. The gradual changes in our perceptions of hell as it moves from being a fixed place to the more spatialized hellscapes continues to profoundly affect our literature today. So in dissecting hellscapes in its initial conception across the 19th century, perhaps we can more fully understand hell's resurgence in our present moment. I'm just going to take a quick sip of tea before I head on to the next bit. Okay, so it's time, I guess, to look at some hellscapes in action with Thompson's The City of Dreadful Night. Initially, I had this text at the end of the talk, but Thompson isn't called the poet of doom for nothing. And realizing just how depressing Thompson can be, I think I've become so used to it that I forgot. I thought we'd end with Coleridge, which I never thought I would classify Coleridge as the cheerier poet of the two. But there we go, and I've tried to keep it to some of the less depressing parts as well. So The City of Dreadful Night is a 21 canto poem, so it's quite a long poem, and it was published in 1874 as a full version that was serialized before. And it follows an anonymous speaker as they move through an imagined city of perpetual night where the sun has never visited, forming a nightmarish vision proceeding from Thompson's insomniac wanderings. Edwin Morgan highlights that this is not an actual city, though it is certainly based on London and possibly incorporates some of Glasgow, making Thompson's poem representative of various 19th century urban geographies. So if we're thinking about hell being in spatial terms, in this poem, we actually have no fixed location, but rather a generalized city space. So we're already starting to see some of those elements. And Thompson repeatedly brands the city as hellish, describing it as some fate of hell or a termless hell. And the speaker resolves that hell is mild and piteous matched with that accursed wild, implying that the city's conditions are somehow more irreligious and actually worse than hell. Excuse me. However, Amy Hughesby has highlighted that the poem is densely intertextual, including references to Dante's Inferno, such as the epigraph which quotes the inscription above Hell's gates, "Through me you pass into the City of Woe." And literary critics like Morgan have also compared Thompson's poem to Coleridge's Mariner, so there are connections then between these two texts and hellscapes across the 19th century. And Thompson's intertextual references and metaphors are then starting to already enforce the city's likeness to a hellish space, framing this dreadful night as hell-like and beginning to formulate what I'm terming the hellscape. In section 6, the anonymous speaker finds themselves at Hell's gates and attempts to enter, but they find themselves also barred from entry by Hell's gatekeeper. And as a result, the speaker sort of enters this hellscape of urban mundanity where they're just wandering the city aimlessly. And the passage reads as follows. I reached the portal, common spirit's fear, and read the words above it, dark yet clear. Leave hope behind, all ye who enter here. And would have passed in, gratified to gain that positive eternity of pain, instead of this insufferable inane. A demon warder clutched me, not so fast. First leave your hopes behind. But years have passed since I left all behind me to the last. So I returned, our destiny is fell, for in this limbo we must ever dwell, shut out alike from heaven and earth and hell. So we have an explicit Dantean reference here that incorporates more of that inscription above Hell's gates, to leave all hope behind. And kind of structurally, and to contextualize this within the poem, Thomson is echoing Dante's terza rima in rhyming triplets here, unlike the previous cantos which use sestets or six-lined stanzas. So we're building this space into a hellscape not only through repeated hellish allusions, but also through this tighter poetic form. It becomes quite dense here. And I guess for a little bit more close reading now, to see this construction as a hellscape. While the portal implies a transitory gateway between places, when the demon warder clutches the speaker, they prevent their movement and create this narrowed spatial constraint. They're trapped in this transitory place. And this restricted motion then separates the speaker from the common spirits who are passing through to hell, creating the alienated figure despite being crowded into close proximity, which is what Faulkner identified as hell's chronotype. Time equally becomes obtuse here, with repeated references to eternity reflecting the poem's endless nights. But similarly, the speaker also recounts the years and the space that they must ever dwell in. And with all of these temporal indicators, the speaker never actually quantifies them with definitive articles or numbers. So we have an absence of future hope for escaping the city's hellscape. And through this passage, the speaker also moves from the first person I to the collective pronoun we at the end in that pluralized form. So it demonstrates what Faulkner terms the self being destroyed through suffering in catabasis. So we actually are losing the speaker's sense of self throughout this passage. Ultimately, they frame hell as a positive alternative, being more bearable than the dully alliterative, insufferable inane of earth. And Kevin Mills has observed how the city is not a vision of punishment, but an imaginative evocation of eternal terror at the heart of day-to-day reality. So what Mills is highlighting there is how Thomson moves away from hell as a punitive place, but to that imaginative evocation of city living through a spatial metaphor, uncovering the deep-seated terror and hopelessness at the heart of urban living. However, the question has to remain, where exactly is the speaker? While Thomson's poem holds similarities to catabasis, the speaker never actually makes that descent journey. They're barred from entry. They have no hope left to give, which is the entry fee for passing through to hell, having left all behind. So it isolates them outside of heaven and earth and hell. In other words, we're outside, excuse me, so we're outside the known theological geographies in Christianity. Geography here referring to how we understand society and space as per Susan Mayhew's definition. So we're not within a realm that we know. We're not within the structured imagined spaces and places within theology and the fictional representations. So I've included a map there from, it's an interpretation of Dante's circles of hell, but we're not within those kind of known realities. We're somewhere else. We could take the speaker at their word that they are in limbo, or another term for that would be purgatory. But this too is problematic given the 19th century's predominant theological geographies. The Protestant Church of England's Common Book of Prayer states that purgatory is a fond thing vainly invented and grounded upon no warranty of scripture. And it's remained a primarily Roman Catholic doctrine, which in 1851 comprised less than 5% of London's religious congregations, according to a religious census that year. Furthermore, Thomson was a secularist, first serializing the poem in the National Reformer, a newspaper which was founded by the president of the National Secularist Society, Charles Broadley. So the theology of a Christian limbo or purgatory likely didn't exist for Thomson either. So this functions as a kind of abstract liminal space rather than a set theological geography. Wheeler surmises that they find themselves in the ultimate marginal state, in an uncharted theological territory that is both like and unlike hell. The Hellscape then offers a terminology for this space, foregrounding hell's new spatial element as that imaginative evocation that Mills identified. If we recall Massey's terminology, that space becomes the dimension of multiplicity, that this then enables new manifestations of hell and katabatic narratives through Thomson's intertextual allusions. Simultaneously, the speaker becomes disorientated in attempting to navigate this hellish, dreary scope, and Thomson's speaker then becomes trapped within this new spatial territory after being turned away from hell and trapped in this, again, hellish city that resembles earthly urban spaces. And kind of ultimately they end up in this void space. So they wander the city throughout the poem only to end up at an infinite void. So perhaps they view their hellscape as a fate worse than hell in an uncharted location, that it represents the suffering in urban mundanity's insufferable inane. I did promise that Thomson was a cheery poet, so let's have a little look at Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I'm just going to have a quick sip of water as well before I move on to this next section. So, Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is possibly one of my favourite texts of all time. It was first published in 1798, republished with the gloss, which is like an explanatory note from Coleridge, in 1817, and there were various editions and revisions from Coleridge through over the years, and I'm going to be using the 1834 version today, which does include the later additions to Coleridge's gloss. So the poem follows a mariner as he narrates his time on the Antarctic Sea, having been stuck there after somewhat arbitrarily killing an albatross. The mariner's actions condemn him to being in an isolated hellscape on a motionless sea in an immobile time. However, the poem's distinctive quality is in what happens to the mariner after he leaves the ship and learns to navigate the hellscape as it moves with him. However, let's start with the albatross. Oh, I was starting to go backwards here. There we go. So the albatross appears to the mariner and his crew as a bird of good omen and signals a favourable change in the weather, which propels their voyage. The mariner describes the albatross as a Christian soul, implying its virtue and spiritual significance. However, part the first concludes when the mariner states, with my crossbow, I shot the albatross. The six-syllable line does contrast the poem's predominantly iambic tetrameter meter, and to me always sounded like quite a casual tone. It indicates this lack of forethought. It's this casual, offhanded action. And the structural choice does signal quite a dramatic end, and that change in the poem's fortunes for both the mariner and his crew. After killing the albatross, the mariner then states, instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung. It forms a sort of punishment from the crew for his actions. Malcolm Guy explores how this inverts Christian symbolism to create something altogether hellish. He states that one of the many mysteries of the cross is the mystery of substitution. It is Jesus suffering instead of us, So to take that cross away and substitute the albatross is, on the part of the shipmates, a deliberate substitution of blame and vengeance for grace instead of the other way around. So what Guy is arguing here is that the albatross's body substitutes that of Christ, inverting the cross's religious symbol as into something far more vile and repulsive. So symbolically, killing the albatross reverses the salvation that God offers to humanity, implying damnation in an irredeemable action. Once the mariner has killed the albatross, a deterioration of their fortunes begins for him, his crew, and indeed the ship, arguably as a kind of penitent suffering for the albatross's loss of life. In this extract from part 2, the mariner and his crew are beginning to experience some of those consequences for the albatross's death, and the poem reads as follows. "And I had done a hellish thing, and it would work and woe. For all averred, I'd killed the bird that made the breeze to blow. Day after day, we stuck, nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink." So when the mariner says, "I had done a hellish thing," he creates those expectations again for hellish events. However, the mariner makes that comparative between his voyage and an infernal journey without actually fulfilling that generic expectation for descent narratives. He and his shipmates remain on the boat in a seemingly hopeless and static state. While remaining in an earthly space, the boat fulfills Faulkner's criteria for a chronotopic hell, thereby displacing the mariner's implied catabasis into a different space altogether. The repetition of day after day indicates time's endlessness, progressing without change as they are physically stuck without breath nor motion. The scene's immobility then restricts their spatial and temporal movement. And furthermore, the boards did shrink. So the spatial enclosure is actually increasing as the threat to their lives grow without any drop to drink. They are left trapped without any means for survival. The result of this temporal and spatial restriction is their suffering. And Faulkner, as I said, expands that through Hell's chronotype, the experienced isolation and alienation leads to, quote, "the spectacle of the self being destroyed by suffering, the absence of autonomy, and the severance from ordinary life," end quote. And we see this here. The poem moves again from that first person I that they used throughout part 1, and now we're at the collective plural pronoun we, leaving the mariner indistinguishable from his shipmates. The simile, comparing them to a painted ship, reiterates their immobility and continues to diminish their selfhood. They are equivalent to an inanimate object without autonomy or movement. Coleridge's gloss notes that the albatross begins to be avenged in this passage, reflecting the substitution of blame and vengeance onto the mariner for killing the bird that Geit identifies. So collectively, we can see how the mariner's hellish comparison with a restricted time, limited space, and the result of punitive suffering in a severance from daily life culminates into what I'm terming the hellscape. As the mariner's entrapment in this hellscape continues, his isolation increases, and we see that spectacle of the self being destroyed by suffering more and more. Part 3 introduces 2 allegorical figures, which the gloss surmises as death and life and death have diced for the ship's crew, and she, the latter, wins the ancient mariner. So what this passage describes is that death wins the crew in a game of dice. So they go over to death and die with him, whereas life and death wins the mariner. So he is then stuck with life and death as his fate. And she expresses great delight in this, exclaiming, "The game is done, I've won, I've won." So the mariner's isolation is increasing there, negating his selfhood into an undead existence, and is then without the possible reprieve from his hellscape, because it can't come to an end. He's stuck in life and death. So even after escaping the immobilized sea towards the poem's conclusion, we can see that the mariner is trapped within the hellscape's new spatial territory. And this is a crucial difference between hell and theology or catabasis, because without hell's fixed location, the mariner's hellscape can move with him and adapt to new spaces and embody a far more threatening fate than perhaps hell itself. So when the hermit rescues the mariner, as hermits are apparently known to do according to Coleridge, the boat's pilot boy states the devil knows how to row. So having left the ship's hellscape, and you can see there in Dore's illustration, the ship starts to sink. The mariner does seem to regain some of his autonomy. He can row, he can move through the previously immobilizing sea. However, he retains that devilish appearance, maintaining that hell-like quality beyond the singular location. And Geit states that he has every appearance of being one of the undead, or even demonically possessed, hence the pilot's shriek and the boy's hysteria. So despite leaving the physical hellscape, the mariner knows the hellscape. In gaining that spatial aspect, the hellscape becomes malleable beyond that fixed location and perhaps even infiltrates his sense of self. He starts to embody that hellscape, maybe. Following his experience and with the acquired knowledge of the hellscape, the mariner is not free but can live and navigate within this new cursed existence. He acknowledges this, stating, "Since then, at an uncertain hour, that agony returns until my ghastly tale is told." And that uncertainty of the temporal hour is reflecting that hellscape's restriction again. It's indicating the lasting effects of his hellish experience. So even though the poem is moving into future tense here, he states that his suffering returns until his ghastly tale is told. That feels like quite a Gothic evocation, doesn't it? That the past is returning to haunt the present, except what's returning here isn't a ghost or a singular spirit, but the memory of the hellscape. It's a spatial memory. So time's only progression is in recounting the previously experienced hellscape through that ghastly evocation of fear and horror. The remembered hellscape becomes equally hellish to others then, leaving the listening wedding guest who's been hearing the mariner's tale throughout the poem like one that has been stunned a sadder and wiser man. The simile indicates the wedding guests that the wedding guest understands the hellscape being stunned, so that again we're getting that sense of immobility and resembling that hellscape spatial restriction. And while the wedding guest does become sadder for this understanding, he also becomes wiser and gains knowledge of suffering and punitive consequences for our actions. So the mariner's acquired wisdom is a solemn one of infernal spaces that burdens his existence and then burdens others as he shares his tale. So therefore, maybe the hellscape has a transformative potential in taking an external experience of a restricted space and time and turning it into an equally restricted mental state and a way of being that has the capacity to educate and warn others away from the same fate. So let's just quickly try and, I guess, liven it up a little bit from Coleridge before I conclude. So there are plenty of other texts throughout the 19th century that use the hellscape for various purposes and means. So, for example, The Wreck of the Deutschland by Gerard Manley Hopkins depicts the stormy sea and shipwreck of the Deutschland as a hellscape. So we can see some connections to Coleridge there. But crucially, he uses that turbulent landscape to navigate back towards faith in God and strengthens his faith in God through that. Meanwhile, poets writing in the Lancashire dialects in the 1860s during the cotton famine used the hellscape to showcase their dire poverty and advocate for social change. The Brontes frequently allude to hell when describing their wild landscapes, challenging visions of the English pastoral in profoundly ecological ways. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that when hell starts to shift from being a fixed place of a punitive afterlife into a spatial metaphor, then the hellscape's occurrences and manifestations become as numerous as its uses and applications. So while I'm applying this term retrospectively, I hope this talk has helped unearth a little bit of how writers and artists are repeatedly utilizing the hellscape's features to explore the things that terrify us the most. And as such, to argue for the hellscape's vital conception as a literary space, illustrating hell's lasting impact. So the next time you use hell as a curse or as a metaphor, or even to describe an unpleasant landscape, I hope you can now know that you are actually engaging with an ongoing discourse of the infernal and the hellish that continues to dominate our literary imaginations far long after its supposed decline. Thank you very much.